Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 331, Dake's Advancement. That's right, it was a throbbing, an uneasiness that came from the heart, and a fear of the unknown. The large hole in front of him was dark and deep, and a thick black fog gathered within. However, due to the large number of carved sacred sun pattern on the surrounding stone walls, it was barely sealed within the large hole and was unable to completely permeate out. Only a small amount of tiny black fog could spread out. What a big move! Bunduke spoke with a serious tone. The black fog wrapped around his body and was immediately absorbed by him. It solidified the phantom image of the abyssal demon behind him and made his inner power faintly stronger. As an apostle of the underworld, he was absorbing the power of the demons contained in the black fog. These were all powers of the same origin. However, Bunduke was still cautious about the stone wall in front of him. A large number of sacred sun pattern were carved on the stone wall, and there was even gold poured into it. Threads of golden light circulated within the sacred pattern. Even around the 10-meter-tall hole in front of him, there was a mysterious formation formed by the sacred sun pattern that was nearly 50 meters wide. However, the gold that was poured into it had already broken, because the entire stone wall had cracked. It seemed to have been freed by a huge force. From this, it could be imagined that the abyssal demon that had been sealed in the large hole had finally accumulated enough power to break free from the seal. After using all its strength, it had successfully escaped from this sealed place. In order to vent its anger, it had also wantonly destroyed this abandoned underground city that had been lost for a long time. This included the sacred sun pattern on the stone wall. Standing in front of it, if one looked carefully, one could see all kinds of cleaving marks on the rock wall. They were very clear. However, the means of the gods were still powerful. Even after 10,000 years, the array formed by these sacred patterns still played a faint role. Other than destroying the city and the stone wall, the abyssal demon could not cause much damage to the buildings and important places protected by the sacred sun pattern. Perhaps with the flow of time, the power of the abyssal demon would gradually recover and eventually grow strong enough to ignore the sacred sun pattern and easily crush the sealed land that had trapped it for 10,000 years. However, all of this was interrupted by Kant. He led his troops and walked on the land of the ancient passage, eliminating the demonized creatures that the demons had nurtured. At the same time, he killed the most powerful and most terrifying demon lord in the sealed land Amenkik. Kant was the ultimate victor. Even the spirit body of the ancient god's descendant, the old man who was the pope of the sun god sect, could not kill it. "Let's go in and take a look," Kant said. As he spoke, he also took a step forward and activated his divine domain. A faint golden light mixed with white light brought with it a holiness that no evil could approach. 10 lion knights protected the surroundings and entered the hole that had once sealed the demons with Kant. The pitch-black fog seemed to have been stimulated and began to roll and sway. A hiss of sorrow appeared. The thick fog was still filled with emotional hatred and madness. They even came into contact with the divine domain like moths flying into a flame. They rushed up and attached themselves to the outer domain. The positive energy that represented the divinity and justice exerted its powerful side, dispersing and purifying the unimaginable filth in the black fog. The black fog was the power that the abyssal demon had dispersed. It had taken many years to take shape. No, it was not just years. It was tens of thousands of years. After such a long time, brewing in this sealed space, this black fog that contained endless demonic energy would probably be able to give birth to another powerful abyssal demon in the abyss. It would not be a problem at all. Even Kant felt his heart palpitate faster. As his heart beat racing, the outer area of the surrounding divine domain was emitting sizzling sounds like oil heating up. Whoosh, whoosh. It was as if the sound of wind appeared from this thick black fog. In the large hole, it was more like there were countless living beings crying out in grief, with hatred towards the living, and with a twisted madness that belonged to the abyss. It was extremely terrifying. Damn it! Kant gritted his teeth. After entering the cave, the black fog had actually caused him to suffer. Cold sweat appeared on his head. Now that he was standing at the edge of the cave, the divine domain around him had been suppressed to a range of 5 meters. It could only protect him, the 10 lion knights who were anxious but still could not do anything. All of this happened in a short period of time. But Kant understood in his heart. He turned his head with difficulty to look in the direction of the hole. Kant gritted his teeth. That damn old guy. The predicament he was in now was definitely the trick of the old Pope of the Sun God sect. There was indeed the sacred sun disk here, but in fact, after sealing the abyssal demon for tens of thousands of years, since it was able to escape, it meant that this sealed land had lost its effect. Even the sun disk was unable to work. The old Pope of the Sun God sect had definitely guessed the changes in this place, but he didn't tell Kant. He even deliberately let Kant come here and using someone else to kill Kant. The old Pope, who had already lost all his power and turned into an energy spirit body, had no intention of compromising at all. Even if he really had less than half a year left to live, he would let Kant, the human noble who had killed his daughter and buried the glory of the gods, die miserably. And now, this old Pope's plan had hit Kant's weakness. He did not expect the negative energy contained in the big hole to be so strong. So strong that he could not resolve it by himself. However, Kant's eyes were still calm. There was no despair or fear in them. Instead, he shouted, "Bunduk, have you not finished dealing with the sacred sun pattern outside and come in? It's a bit difficult." "Half a minute." Banduk answered from outside. At this moment, his entire body was covered in black fog. The phantom image of the abyssal demon had already appeared behind him as if it was corporeal. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws as if it was about to be resurrected. It was completely ferocious. It was precisely because of this dense evil power that he was unable to enter the large hole of the sacred sun pattern seal. Although the seal had been broken, there was still a bit of strength left in it. However, Bunduk didn't care at all. His forehead furrowed as he pushed his entire body towards the inner side with brute force. The entire seal formed by the sacred sun pattern had turned into a golden membrane, and it was also beginning to distort. The two sides were in a stalemate for 20 to 30 seconds. Pop! A faint sound appeared. Bunduk had already broken through the seal and appeared in the large cave. He happened to be standing at the entrance of the cave where the two worlds intersected. He reported in a deep voice, "Lord Kant, I'm here." "Very good." Kant nodded. "I'll leave it to you." "Understood." Bunduk quickly replied. As he entered, the pressure Kant was facing suddenly decreased. The layers of black fog within the large cave seemed to have found a vent, it instantly rushing towards the direction behind him, which was also Bunduk's direction. The thick fog was rolling, just like waves and waves. Whoosh, whoosh. The thick black fog in the large cave stirred, emitting the sound of real wind. The phantom shadow of the abyssal demon behind Bunduk became more and more solid, but the chain formed by the data flow on his body was even more obvious. With the help of Bunduk's body, it firmly locked every part of the abyssal demon. No matter how the phantom shadow swayed and struggled crazily, it did not have the slightest ability to escape. This was the enhancement of the power of the entire Pender world. Bunduk was an apostle of the underworld. He had the demonic evil powers, but in terms of purity and level, it was far from what the abyssal demon could compare to. With the support of the system, not only did they trap the demonic power of this world, but they also absorbed and complemented each other, turning Bunduk into an apostle. He had become an even stronger existence. For example, right now, the phantom shadow was gradually being pulled into Bunduk's figure by the data chain. The former captain of the crossbowmen had already been enveloped by the black fog, and his demonic appearance seemed to have taken shape. Ding system prompt. Underworld Apostle Bunduk has absorbed additional powers, acquired new ability, Demonic Incarnation. Special effect 4, Demonic Incarnate, release all devil power and fight as a devil of the underworld. All attributes plus 500% and incarnates as a devil of the underworld. Attacks have the effect of hellfire, causing an additional 300% continuous damage. The system gave a prompt, which was clearly displayed on Kant's retina. The black fog in the big hole disappeared. Kant turned his head to look at Bunduk, whose eyes were still closed, just like he was recalling the charm of the power that had entered his body just now. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. As expected, it's just as I thought. When he first came into contact with the underground city wall, the black fog had been absorbed by Bunduk. At that time, this underworld apostle had said that his power seemed to have increased by a little. Kant had a guess from this. That was why he dared to be so unbridled. On the surface, he even believed the old Pope's words. He brought Bunduk and the others to this sealed land and successfully promoted Bunduk to a stronger level. A full 700% buff was simply unimaginable. A Lion Knight with a 250% buff could easily kick open a thick wooden door. With all the attributes added up, Bunduk already had 1000%. It was estimated that he could even kick open the steel Vajra city gate. I can feel the power surging in my body. Bunduk opened his eyes were scarlet red. Cruelty and brutality appeared in his expression. As the data chain circulated, his expression also carried a sense of loyalty towards Kant. Lord Kant, at your command, I can do a lot now. Very good. Kant nodded lightly. That old fellow will regret it. He must. Bunduk clenched his fingers and said, I will let his spirit body feel the burning flames of hell. Yes, he will be punished. Kant nodded, the corners of his mouth curling up. No one could live leisurely without offending him. When he led the team back, the old Pope would be buried by the river of history again. However, at the moment, Kant looked at an altar deep in the cave and narrowed his eyes slightly. Sun discs. 6 sun discs were placed around the altar. However, at the top of the altar, there was an obsidian-like stone table. An item that looked like a Western wine flask was placed in the middle. It was faintly releasing black fog, bringing about a strange feeling that came from the bottom of one's heart. Chapter 332, The Pot of Greed. The wine pot was simple and unadorned. It had a big belly and a small opening. It was a classic Western style. The black fog in the large cave had already been absorbed by Bunduk, however, around the wine pot on the obsidian table, there was still a faint black fog swirling. This wine pot attracted everyone's attention, including Kant's. He walked forward. At the end of this huge cave, the altar made of stone and the obsidian table on it both looked demonic. The wine pot also made Kant feel a sense of greed. The Lion Knights beside him also moved and followed. They raised the kite-shaped shield in their left hand and held the knight sword tightly in their right hand. They looked like a guard. However, through the gaps in the visor, their eyes revealed greed that seemed to have been attracted to something. They moved their feet and subconsciously swallowed their saliva. If it were not for their loyalty to Kant, they would have rushed up and taken that demonic wine pot, held it tightly in arms, longing to occupy it alone. Their thoughts began to become slow and blur. As Kant approached the wine pot with the Lion Knights, the divine domain around him, which was still eye-catching, had faded a little. Kant had let down his guard. But in an instant, a dialogue box popped up on his retina, waking Kant up. Ding! Special quest issued. Special quest, The Pot of Greed. Reward, 10 honor, 1000 reputation, 10,000 dinars. Introduction. When you came to this sealed cave, you realized that things were not that simple, especially the wine pot that seemed to be able to arouse your desire. It even carried a mysterious power. When you regained your consciousness and were upset over your loss of self-control just now, you also planned to take a good look at what that wine flask was. A notification from the system. Kant frowned slightly. Having regained his consciousness, he looked towards the altar in front of him. The wine pot on the obsidian table, he could not help but snort coldly. and the divine domain around his body became even denser. The golden light of the king's divine might was mixed with the holy white light, and the divine domain enveloped the surroundings. The lion knights were also startled awake. Thinking of the greed and desire in their hearts just now, they gritted their teeth and felt even more ashamed. As the mainstay of the kingdom of Sarleon, the strongest national knights on the Pendar continent, they should have their own pride and honor, including restraint and strict control of their desires. However, they definitely lost their composure just now. No, not just now, but they had done the same thing before. Their continuous mistakes made them feel incompetent and ashamed. Kant, on the other hand, looked very indifferent. "It's not because of you." He looked at the wine pot in front of him and could not help but take a deep breath. "Even I could not resist the attraction of that strange wine pot. That should be a sacred artifact of the demons." Bunduk walked over from behind. The black fog and demonic phantoms all over his body had already disappeared. Other than his slightly reddened eyes, his entire person looked no different from before. Even after entering the divine domain, he was able to calmly wait. "A sacred artifact of the demons." Kant frowned and exclaimed. "Yes." Bunduk nodded. After absorbing the demonic energy from the black fog, his power had skyrocketed, and his ability to sense things had nearly doubled. "A sacred artifact of the demons can stir up emotions of greed." Had. Kant chuckled, the corners of his mouth curling up. "Emotions." "That's right, emotions." Bunduk answered affirmatively, "We need to be careful." The abilities of the demon race were not completely brutal and crazy. They, who came from the abyss and hell, were also masters of controlling emotions. For example, greed, irascibility, excitement, lust, and so on. These were all the specialties of the demons. If they stimulated their emotions to the extreme, that would be madness, and that was also the reason why creatures who had come into contact with the demons for a long time would eventually go mad. If they could not even control their emotions freely, wouldn't that be madness? Kant was solemn. The divine domain around him became even denser. He took a step forward and walked up to the altar. Around him were the 6 dim sun discs. On the floor paved with stone slabs, there were countless sacred sun pattern carvings within, but most of them were broken. Occasionally, gold could be seen pouring into it, but it could not take form because it was broken. Back then, the sun god sex seal on the abyssal demon was indeed very strong. But when Kant walked up to the altar, the sacred sun pattern did not move at all. Even the lion knights and Bunduk who were behind him walked up, but there was still nothing abnormal. Obviously, the sacred sun pattern here had completely lost its effect, and the seal in the cave had been broken and was about to fade away. Only the sacred sun pattern at the Temple of the Sun and the underground city wall was still barely keeping the seal in effect. Just by looking at the 6 dim sun discs, one could tell that the river of time had long exhausted the divine power in it. But that was not the main point. Kant walked step by step to the top of the altar. He was getting closer and closer to the obsidian table, and there was also that black wine pot. It carried a strange aura. As the black fog spread, it was trying to control the emotions of Kant and the others, but it was blocked out by the dense divine domain. However, even with the divine domain, Kant could still feel his emotions being stimulated. Fortunately, he was prepared this time. His left hand held the hilt of the sword of King by his waist. As the king's power of this divine artifact poured into his body, Kant took a deep breath and placed his right hand on the strange wine pot. A ringing sound rang in his ears. Kant's thoughts instantly appeared as his hand touched the wine flask, and he couldn't control his thoughts at all. All kinds of thoughts appeared in his mind, most of them were memories he had encountered in the past, but those thoughts controlled his emotions. In his heart, all the people and things that he had encountered all triggered his negative emotions. This included dissatisfaction, hatred, jealousy, slander, suspicion, and so on. But most of all, it was greed for everything. Kant wanted to take everything, to have everything, even if he had to be smashed into pieces and never be able to recover. But immediately after, the sword of King in his left hand trembled slightly. A magnificent and majestic might of King instantly appeared in his body, washing away all kinds of negative emotions in his mind. Finally, Kant woke up in an instant and regained his consciousness. The system also added some help at this time. Ding system prompt. Unknown strange object found. It can be absorbed by the system to fill in the rules of this world. Choose to let the system absorb? Yes/no. Kant naturally did not hesitate. Looking at the strange wine flask in his right hand, he said with certainty, absorb. Data flow instantly appeared in his palm and directly wrapped around the wine pot, as if it caused some sort of struggle. Wisps of thin but abnormally pure black fog attempted to escape from the mouth of the pot but were pulled back by the data chain. Ding, after your tireless efforts, mission completed. Special quest, Pot of Greed completed. Reward, 10 honor, 1000 reputation, 10,000 dinars. Introduction, you have obtained this mysterious wine pot that can control emotions. Just as its code name, Pot of Greed, who come into contact with this wine pot will cause endless negative emotions in the heart, as well as a feeling of greed towards all living things. Fortunately, you have resisted the erosion of this emotion, and are still in good condition and rational. The system showed a dialog box. Kant's hand was empty, but the small wine pot had already been absorbed by the system. And when the wine pot disappeared, the gloomy and dark appearance in the cave instantly disappeared. Even in the surrounding 6 sun disks, there were faint flowing lights in the golden patterns. It was obvious that the wine pot, which contained endless dark power, was actually suppressing the 6 sun disks. Put them all away, Kant turned his head and ordered. He waved his hand to the lion knights behind him and said, "We've wasted enough time. Let's put away these sun disks. After we finish the old man in the temple, we should go back and finish off the undead in Aran Desert." Understood, the lion knights nodded. They walked down the altar and carefully unloaded all the sun disks. The danger in the cave had been eliminated. Kant also put away the divine domain. However, Bunduk was still a guard at the side. He carefully looked at the surrounding rock walls. There used to be murals on them, but most of them had been peeled off over the long period of time. From a distance, he could vaguely see that it was the battle between the Sun God sect and the Abyssal demons. It was so tragic that the sky turned dark. Countless members had died on both sides. There were even powerful divine sons and demon lords who had fallen. But in the end, the Sun God sect still won. But even if they won, they did not kill these demon lords who had deep connections with the abyss. They could only seal these demons and use up their final strength. Similarly, they chose to seal themselves. The specific details could not be seen completely because of the peeling of the mural. There was also no information about humans and other races. In short, the mural in the stone wall was to praise the greatness of the Sun God sect, the sacrifice of the Sun God sect, and the infinite worship to the Sun God. Just look at the high and mighty sun, one would know that during the era of the gods, the might of the Sun God covered the world. It was not something that an ordinary god could compare with. Kant did not say much about this. Any brilliant religious civilization would exaggerate their god to an unimaginable extent. In fact, it was a matter of opinion. At least Kant did not meet the so-called god. And he had killed more than one of those god descendants. At least in the temple, the old man with evil intentions was about to become a ghost under his sword, the kind that would never be reincarnated. After wrapping the sun disks, Kant led the team out of the cave. He walked along the road towards the temple again but stopped when he reached the temple. At the top of the temple, the old pope of the Sun God sect was emitting a sparkling white light, holding a scepter and standing in front of the stone door. It seemed that he was welcoming Kant's arrival. However, Kant did not hold back at all. He stood at the bottom of the temple and held the hilt of his sword with his right hand. He said slowly, "Old man, give me an explanation." If you don't satisfy me this time, I think you will be completely destroyed. Chapter 333, The Lingering Will of the Dead. Kant's question did not incite fear in the Pope. Perhaps he had no fear to begin with. Standing quietly at the top of the temple, the Pope only had indifference in his eyes. There was no sadness, no joy, and no fear. He only calmly replied, "The lowly humans stole the authority of the gods. They speak of their own power, slander the glory of the gods, and blaspheme the glory of the gods. Yet, they enjoy the peace and tranquility brought by the gods." He he. Kant chuckled. He lifted his head and looked at the old Pope. With an indifferent gaze, he pulled out half of the king's sword from his waist. "I can give you one more chance to reorganize your words. Lowly and disgusting human noble." The Pope spoke indifferently, propping up his scepter. "I should have disappeared into the long river of history, but because of the power of my God, I have remained eternally. Now is the time to protect the glory of my God. I will not back down." "Good, good, good." Kant nodded lightly. "Well said." A brilliant golden light appeared. The extraordinary power in his body had already been activated. Holding the sword of the king tightly, Kant walked towards the steps of the temple. Behind him, Dake and the Lion Knights of Sarian also followed him. Their hands were already on the hilt of their swords, ready to pull out their weapons at any time. "I am ready to die." The Pope did not move. He looked at Kant, who was slowly walking over, and hatred appeared in his eyes. "You humans who have betrayed the glory of the gods will eventually die. At that time, you will be more desperate than me. Is that so?" Kant had a faint smile on his face. "Something is not right. I'm ready to sacrifice myself." The Pope had a determined look on his face. "Come on." "Wait, old man." Kant smiled helplessly. "Why do you look like an old comrade who died heroically while I'm the executioner of the villain's regime? Do you think that's reasonable?" But the old Pope still held his scepter and looked at Kant quietly. He did not understand this kind of joke. And Kant did not need him to understand it. Finally arriving in front of this spirit body that did not have the slightest ability to resist, Kant directly stabbed the king's sword into the old Pope's abdomen and said calmly, "Compared to your daughter, you're easier to kill her. I curse you." The Pope's eyes finally fluctuated. However, he couldn't even finish his sentence. Spiritual bodies did not have the slightest ability to fight. Their bodies, which were made up of souls and ordinary energy, had almost received the violent king's power from the king's sword. It was a type of scorching positive energy that instantly ignited the Pope's spiritual body. The golden flames instantly burned the Pope's spiritual body to ashes. "It's settled." Kant put his sword back into its sheath and asked calmly, "What are you talking about?" Kant was the one who had the upper hand now. He was the overlord of this situation. Even after all he said and cursed, in fact, to Kant, it was just a matter of one sword strike. Looking at the white dots of light that were dissipating in the sky, Kant calmly commented, "You think too highly of yourself." He had nothing to say to the charlatans and religious madmen. Woo woo woo. Just as the old Pope's spiritual body was directly destroyed, a whimper suddenly appeared in the temple. A gentle breeze appeared in the void. It came from the temple hall. It rushed out from the corridor, mixed with countless tiny blue specks of light, and directly pounced on the scattered spiritual bodies in the sky. Like insects surrounded by ants, it coiled up layer by layer. There was also that seemingly venomous whimper, as well as deep hatred. "The remnant obsessions of the dead," Dake said, feeling the death of that old fellow. All of them surged out. Even if their obsessions would completely disappear, they would still fight to the death with the remnant light spots of that old fellow. How cruel! The Lion Knights shook their heads. Looking at the scattered light spots in the sky, they only felt that they were like beautiful fireworks. When have they ever been innocent? How can that Pope be considered a good person? After saying that, Kant did not comment much on this. Instead, he waved his hand and said, "Gather your emotions and unload the solar disk at the top of the temple. It's time for us to leave." "Yes." The Lion Knights immediately responded. The other 4 Lion Knights who had not yet carried the solar disk jumped onto the top of the temple nimbly. Their physical fitness far exceeded that of ordinary knights. As extraordinary knights, the terrain could not restrict their movements at all. They swiftly arrived at the top of the temple and deftly unloaded the sun disk. This was what Kant needed the most. It was settled smoothly. Kant nodded and said, "Let's go." They left the way they came. This exploration was very successful. 7 similar disks were enough to level up the sun disk in Aran City, and the one in Trondheim Castle could cover an area of 50,000 square meters. The main body of the castle had been declared safe. And the soldiers in the main body of the castle could also guard the local area safely. Even if the death shroud of the undead appeared, the endless skeletons and zombies would pounce on them. When they faced the towering city walls, they would still die on the spot. They couldn't do anything to Kant and the others at all. The undead didn't have so-called siege weapons. In fact, they were the incarnations of obsession and remnant souls. They were called the undead because of their uniqueness. With the strength of the human race, without a strategic buff like the death canopy to the undead, even an ordinary peasant or armed militia would be able to deal with a large number of low-level skeletons and zombies. After all, the undead only had bones or rotten flesh left. Compared to the muscles of the human race, which could burst out in strength at any time, the individual zombies were nothing to worry about. The only thing to be afraid of was the undead's talent. No increase in morale will affect combat strength, and no soldiers will collapse or escape due to the dire situation on the battlefield. No consumption, no physical or logistical consumption, and long-term marching does not require supplies at all. No casualties, the so-called casualties are only a concept to the undead. Wherever there are corpses, there will be countless undead armies. An excellent race that nurtured their skills through battle. If one wanted to deal with the undead, in any world or movie, they would be eliminated before they could grow and develop. Once they took shape, the endless undead armies would take shape, even forming the most terrifying undead calamity in the legends. It would turn the entire world into a world of the undead, and the civilizations and countries would be in extreme danger. That was a terrifying phenomenon that could destroy any civilization. Kant used to be afraid of this. Because the curtain of death that spread from the depths of the Naran desert was almost endless. Perhaps it was the undead calamity. But now, with the method that he could finally restrain, he was at ease. At the very least, if the sun disk couldn't hold on any longer, there was still the spring water from the spring of nature given by the treant in The Lord of the Rings. Drinking it would allow one to possess the divine power of nature and gain the ability to resist the curtain of death. Most importantly, if Kant's divine domain was released at full force, it could also protect a radius of 100 meters around him. If he couldn't hold on, he would be able to kill his way out. Of course. This was the worst outcome. If one were to look at it optimistically, the sun disk and royal knights that Kant currently possessed were enough to resist the undead. At the very least, back in the curtain of death, the royal knights and the king's sword at Kant's waist were able to resist the erosion of the curtain of death. Although it still made them feel a little overwhelmed, it was actually because they had thought too much into it. Perhaps I have thought too deeply. Kant's brows relaxed slightly. He brought the Lion Knights back to the gap of the city wall, where the desert bandits were waiting in boredom. When they saw Kant and the others come out, they hurriedly came over and bowed. At the same time, they transferred all the sun disks that the Lion Knights carried onto their backs. This was a conscious attitude. In any case, they had come here to do chores. On the square outside the city wall, a few bonfires had been lit, and the rotten demon corpses had been thrown in and burned to ashes. The underground city was still peaceful. The fluorescent mushrooms and the shimmering moss released a light that was as gentle as the moonlight. The warhorse gently used their hooves to pull, and they were very curious about the glowing plants that grew out of the cracks in the stone. Plants that could not be seen in the surface world. However, the taste was ordinary and did not suit the taste of the warhorse. After chewing for a while, they spat it out. Each and every one of them shook their heads and hissed softly, as if they were complaining about the disgusting taste of these glowing plants. "Everyone, get ready." Kant turned over and mounted his warhorse. He shook the reins and looked at the underground city that was still shrouded by the dim yellow light behind him. He said in a deep voice, "We should go back." Behind him, the knights and cavalry had already gotten on their horses. They quickly checked and packed their luggage. They quietly rode their horses and stood behind Kant. The rewards from coming to the underground city this time could not be said to be small. Just Dake alone had received an excellent promotion. If one were to look at the troop class, he could be considered a level 8 soldier. However, his individual attributes were still slightly inferior. However, if he went all out, a 1000% increase in attributes was enough to be called a humanoid beast. Kant was somewhat helpless about this. Although the original Dake was romantic, he definitely could not be considered evil. Moreover, he had a love for the commoners. He would rather not have a noble identity and take up the position of a civil protection officer, which was a more symbolic position. He could be considered as a general who truly loved the commoners, pitied the commoners, and acknowledged the commoners. He was an outstanding person in the justice camp. However, he was such an upright person, yet he ended up becoming an underworld apostle. Kant could not help but sigh. But it did not matter. In the end, he still chose to be loyal to him. He shook the reins and lightly knocked on the warhorse beneath him. Kant spurred the horse forward to the ancient passage and officially led the team to leave. According to the original plan, he still planned to head to the Eastern County Territory. It was through the other ancient passage in the dungeon that went from north to south. He would enter the Resnistican River and investigate the current situation of the Dukedom of Leo. After all, he had been away for too long. Kant had already lost his ability to control the intelligence of this dukedom. "I still need to wait." Kant suppressed this plan in his heart. The most important thing at the moment was, of course, to get rid of the undead's death curtain so that he would be in an invincible position. Chapter 334, Proper City Planning. After nearly half a day of trekking, the warhorse was already extremely exhausted. What was gratifying was that a fire had already appeared in front of them. That was the location of the temple ruins. It was also the starting point of the ancient passage during the current trekking process. They had already returned. In front of them was the underground of Aran City. Kant's second base. Perhaps it was because they heard the sound of horse hooves coming from the ancient passage. The 50 Rhodex soldiers in charge of security were holding heavy swords that looked like halberds as they waited in formation. Only Lord Kant and his troops were able to gallop in this passage. This was an iron law, a death order. If there were strangers, these elite level 5 infantrymen would not hesitate to step forward with their weapons to teach them a lesson. If there were enemies, then they would die in front of them. The Rhodex were like rocks in the mountains, stubborn and unyielding. They could do whatever they set their mind to. They would carry out the orders they received seriously. And since they had already pledged their loyalty to Kant to heed his orders, then this ancient passage could only be used by their Supreme Lord and his troops. Others would not be allowed to step foot. Moreover, the most important thing was that outsiders could enter this ancient passage that might lead to an unknown region. The sounds of horse hooves became more and more frequent. In the ancient passage, Kant and his group finally arrived at the entrance. Rhodex soldiers held torches. Seeing that their lord had arrived, they hurriedly put down their weapons and bowed respectfully. "Welcome back, my lord." Very good." Kant nodded. Riding the horse in front, he pulled the reins of his warhorse, and his speed gradually decreased. Leading the team, he slowly walked out of the ancient passage. The warmth from the torches and bonfires immediately made him happy and relaxed. He took a deep breath of the smoke-filled air and ordered, "Everyone, help us transport our spoils of war." "Yes." Rodok's soldiers nodded in agreement. On the back of the desert bandits, there were also those heavy sun discs. Although there were desert horses that were good at carrying loads, the journey was bumpy. They only rested for a short period of time. When they arrived, the desert bandits and the desert horses under them were all exhausted. Rodok's soldiers took the sun discs off their backs and walked towards the passage together. These were the spoils of war that needed to be transported to the surface. The desert bandits were stroking the mane of their desert horses with their hands. The journey was no less tiring than a long ride in war. It was also hard on these animals. Seeing the desert horses shaking their heads and breathing white mist, one could tell that they were very tired. "When we go back, give them some high-quality fodder." Dake also led the horses over. Looking at the fatigued appearance of the desert horses, he nodded his head in admiration and said, as expected of the horse stud that was cultivated in the Salander Desert. "In terms of toughness, it is even stronger than the horse stud of the Swadian people." "You flatter me." The desert bandits replied modestly, but there was also excitement on their faces. "This is the truth." Dake smiled. When they arrived at the temple ruins, everyone relaxed. Not only did the Rodok soldiers take care of all the supplies, there was also hot water prepared beforehand for drinking. Stationed in the temple ruins, hot water was always boiling on the bonfire. After all, it was very cold here, the temperature was very low, and there was frost in the corner. There had to be warmth from the bonfire and hot water to replenish the heat. After all, there was an underground river nearby. The river water had just surged out of the surface and absorbed the heat in the air. Not to mention this. It was the same even in the ancient passage. There was no direct sunlight all year round, so they could only use leather jackets and leather clothes to keep out the cold. Although it was not like the night in the Naran Desert, where the temperature could be -20 to 30 degrees Celsius, the near-zero temperature still made them feel cold even when they were riding warhorse, even if they were wrapped in leather jackets. Drinking the hot water handed over by Rodok's soldiers, they felt warm all over. Kant and the others did not stay in the temple ruins for too long. Even Rodok's soldiers gradually withdrew from this alert point as Kant and the others returned safely. Soon after, there would be 10 people and one team of Rodok's spear-wielding soldiers stationed there. These level 5 Rodok soldiers were still stationed at the city walls and city gates. Defending the city was more important. Ever since the town upgraded to a city, it became completely different. Kant walked out of the tunnel. Having gotten used to the dimness, the bright sunlight made him squint. "I'm back." He couldn't help but sigh softly. The underground world and the surface were entirely different universes. In the underground world, there were space restrictions in all directions. That kind of pressure on the soul couldn't be erased no matter how hard he tried. It couldn't be compared to the surface world, this vast world. As they walked up the stone-paved stairs to the top of the mountain, the changes here were also very obvious. Kant stared. When he left, he arranged for James to start building this mountain peak. Now, although the specific environment had not changed, a large number of construction workers had already appeared on this mountain peak. Moreover, in the various open spaces, they had already used white lime as a line to draw the outline of the building. The entire peak of the mountain had already been planned, and it was densely packed with traces of the building. Seeing Kant's return, many construction workers and Rodok's commoners cheered and saluted. "Good." Kant nodded his head to indicate. Very soon, James also walked over quickly. He saluted in respect and said, "Lord Kant, you're back." "Yes." Kant looked around at the huge number of construction workers around him, which probably numbered in the thousands, and asked, "Are the preparations for construction all finished?" "Yes, they are all from Varaga's construction team." James nodded. "The planning has been completed." Kant said, "Give me a brief update." Although he had given authority to James, he still needed to understand the detailed planning process. Now, he had to give a brief explanation. James would have to report the document to Kant later. City planning was not a small matter. It was crucial to the future of the city. James also understood. Heading in the direction of the council hall, James said, "Lord Kant, please follow me." The two of them walked forward. Along the way, the construction workers and the civilians who helped them bowed one after another. Their faces were filled with happy smiles and a vision of their future lives. This was the city they were going to live in. Kant was also satisfied with their spirit and energy. This was his city and its residents. With the council hall as the main center of the city in the future, it will be the city hall that will manage the city. James walked. While reporting, he said, "I have divided the 6,000 acres of land on the mountain into two parts. The front part is the residential area and the commercial area, while the back part is the industrial area. Whether it is handicraft or light industry, or the production of the military industry in the future, they will be placed in the back part." Kant nodded. Yes, the former residential area and the industrial area at the back have formed an effective complement. The planning isn't bad. Thank you for your praise. James smiled and continued reporting. Outside the city wall, such as the rivers and lakes at the city gate, is the breeding industry. If possible, I want to move all the chicken farms, apiary farms, and sheep farms from the mountain to the outside. Kant delegated authority to this. It's up to you. The city level could be replanned. As a city, it could already build chicken farms and sheep farms. It was on the list of buildings for agriculture and animal husbandry, including local fishing grounds. As long as there were lakes and rivers, it could be built. Although the city lacked a lot of military buildings, there was no lack of civil buildings. Agriculture, animal husbandry, handicraft industry, commerce, and so on were all available. The list of buildings was many times more than the castle. James had a lot of options, but if a city in the mountains wanted to be the best city, these agriculture and animal husbandry could not be placed in the city wall. All of them had to be moved out of the city wall. James continued to report, "I plan to develop agriculture on the east side with this river as the center, and animal husbandry on the west side. Also, I plan to cut down the forests and develop the hills on the shore of the lake under the mountain rocks, and continue to develop agriculture and animal husbandry. Bit by bit, I plan to develop the terraced fields and suitable breeding grounds around the area where the mountain peak is located." It's a lot of work. Kant frowned slightly. Yes. James was sure, but he said in a low voice, "I plan to finish it in 3 years. After all, with the help of your miracle power, as long as it is built and reclaimed, a miracle will be born in the shortest time." Indeed. Kant nodded. The miracle that James mentioned was actually the system construction. Not only the buildings, but even the farmland could be built by the system. By changing the rules and topography of this world, it could be formed directly. There was no need to consider the so-called traditional slash-and-burn farming. It could be built directly into a good fertile farmland. This could be reflected in the construction. Just like the wheat fields and chickpea fields that Kant had built on the east side of the river, it was just like this. The rules changed the landscape from barren and rugged mountains to well-cultivated terraced fields, just like the terraced fields formed after years of leveling the mountains. James continued to report on the plan. But everything else were just detail. Kant listened carefully and made a lot of suggestions. The city plan was perfect, and Kant was not stingy with his praise. Following the busy construction workers and the spending of nearly 200,000 dinar, the city planning was decided. The general plan didn't change. As Varga's construction team transported a large amount of materials, the construction began. Kant didn't plan to use up important reputation points to speed up the development. If he really did, he estimated that he would need tens of thousands of reputation points. For Kant, he still had to use his reputation points carefully. After all, Aran City was built in a mountain range. No one knew about it, so there was no danger. The reason why Trondheim Castle was built directly with reputation points was because Kant was afraid of being disturbed by unfamiliar troops during the construction process. After all, they had just finished off the Jack Allen Expeditionary Force and were still under the threat of the noble families of the Dukedom of Leo. Unlike now, Kant had the advantage and the leading power. Chapter 335, The Feud Between Noble Families. In the Sinway Range, a new city was being built. People were eager to see this city completed as soon as possible and become their home in the future. However, Kant didn't stay here for long. Although he was the lord of this place. But in the depths of the Naran Desert, the Oasis lookout, where the Trondheim Castle was still waiting for his return. The purpose of coming here was to find the sun disk. In the depths of the desert, the mysterious undead that had appeared, and the strategic level buff Death Canopy, were still waiting for him to crack. Now that he had found a way to crack it and even found a divine artifact that could perfectly protect the local environment, Kant had to return as soon as possible to resolve this threat and restore peace to his own estate so that he could regain control of this place. 50,000 square meters, an area of 5 hectares. This was Kant's reliance. After enveloping Trondheim's castle, the curtain of death would no longer pose any threat. Even the undead that entered the area covered by the sun disk would be turned into a ball of burning flames because the negative energy in their bodies could not fuse with the positive energy outside. The positive energy was a lethal poison to the undead. They set off again. Kant led the team personally. 10 Lion Knights carried the sun disk that was already wrapped up and followed. However, there was one more person on their return trip this time. That was Dake. As an apostle from the underworld, a hidden force from the world of Pandey and the spokesperson of the underworld, he had already absorbed the power of the abyss demons in this world and underwent an absolute transformation. He could be considered the strongest person at the moment. Among all the forces of Kant, he was the strongest person in terms of combat power. Not to mention the 1000% increase in attributes. He could open the Void Gate once a day and summon a small team of underworld invaders. Although the number of people would definitely not exceed 10, it was precisely these 10 people who could be considered as elites. If one were to count, they would all be at the level 7 troop class. One Demon Avenger, a long-range archer. Using multiple arrows, one person could be used as 10 sniper crossbowmen. Their shooting speed was extremely fast. The rain of arrows from the chain shots could even pierce through steel shields. 2 Demon Berserker. Two-handed combat. They were even stronger than Lion Knights in close combat. What was even more terrifying was that this troop class could teleport. They could charge to their side at a distance of 1000 meters. They raised their two-handed great swords and slashed. They did not care about the terrain at all. Moreover, they could recover their HP when they killed. They could use the blood and lives of their enemies to make up for their own exhaustion and injuries. Demonic Immortal Warriors. Assault Cavalry. Riding on a nightmare that was like a warhorse. Their mobility was extremely strong. Moreover, they could frighten the surrounding creatures. The path they walked would also be covered with the flames of hell. They would suffer the burning effect if they stepped on it. Moreover, they could throw javelins when they were in close combat with their enemies. Similarly, they could throw multiple javelins. Their power was comparable to the siege crossbows that were fired from a bed crossbow. Even heavy armored cavalry could be shot through. These were the main members of the Demon Squad. It was usually made up of 4 Demon Avengers, 3 Demon Berserkers, and 2 Demonic Immortal Warriors. It was precisely these 10 Demon Invader squads that were almost rampaging in the Pandey continent. In the early days, when the Lord did not have a top-tier troop class, or when there were fewer top-tier troop classes, they would often meet a tragic end. Terrifying attack power, terrifying firing speed, terrifying ammunition quantity, and terrifying speed. It was enough to destroy any troop class formation. Even if it was a top-tier troop class, they would have to form a numerical advantage before they could fight. And after the reinforcement of this world, such as the addition of extraordinary power and elemental power, the demon invader squads that belonged to a level 7 troop class would be so powerful that even an ordinary level 6 extraordinary troop class would have to pay a heavy price dealing with them. For example, the Royal Knights and Lion Knights that Kant had now were helpless against the demon invaders. It was worth celebrating. Kant's subordinate, Dake, was the controller of the demon invaders. Therefore, this was Kant's military power. If the battle with the undead reached a stalemate, then the underworld invaders that Dake summoned would have the effect of a surprise attack. They would enter the sky of death and pursue the undead to relieve the pressure on Kant. Including the golems that the mages had summoned, they would be able to reduce the pressure on the defense. However, the most crucial thing was still the ability to defend themselves. If Kant could fend against the attacks of the undead, then he would not need external help. After all, what he could rely on now was still the troop class formed by ordinary soldiers. This was Kant's direct troop class, the key to leading them to sweep through this world. They continued their return journey, leaving the Sinway range and trekking through the Naran desert. The group advanced very quickly. This was because of their extraordinary power. They all had this power, so they could urge their warhorse to run faster. At the same time, they could nourish their warhorse and replenish their stamina, in exchange for the possibility of a long journey. After a day of trekking, they arrived at the central posthouse. "My lord." The patrol team of desert bandits quickly discovered Kant and the others who were coming from the depths of the desert. They crowded over and greeted them warmly. "Yes." Kant nodded. He rode his horse to the top of the dune and looked at the posthouse in the desert plains in the distance. There were many tents set up, and the trade caravan also came and went. He couldn't help but say with satisfaction, "It seems that everything is in order." "Yes, my lord. Ever since the last battle ended, the merchants who came have been very polite." The desert bandits reported the latest information. It was just as Kant had expected. Phaetus had personally led the team, along with 10 Sarian Lion Knights, 120 Swadian Knights, and 500 Swadian infantry to garrison at the Stone Pass. It almost meant that he had complete control of the place. How could the noble families not be shocked? Even Baron Dylan had been taken care of, and the territory had been taken over. This meant that Kant's strength was astonishing. Before they could gather effective intelligence and organize absolute force, the noble families would not be the first to show themselves. Even if they attacked, they would do so in secret. They would not have any conflict with Kant for a short period of time. Although they understood that Kant was a thorn in their side. However, there were also conflicts between the noble families. Especially those families that have existed for hundreds of years. How could they not have any history? Even if there were none, they would definitely take advantage of another when one of them is in decline. They might even take over the other party's territory. That would be even more fruitful than obtaining a salt mine. Therefore, the Naran desert fell into a strange silence. It was similar to a stalemate. But for Kant, it was good news. The longer it dragged on, the more advantageous it would be for Kant's development. It would be even better if he could take advantage of this period of time to directly get rid of the death canopy in the depths of the Naran desert. "Let's go to the posthouse." Kant lightly knocked his legs against the horse's belly and led the team down the dune. After saluting, the desert bandits watched them leave. After all, as scouts and cavalry, these desert bandits had their own patrol mission. They could not let go of any spies who tried to sneak into the depths of the desert, especially those who were close to the Oasis lookout. Recently, they had already gotten rid of quite a number of these guys. It was said that in the underground black market of the Dukedom of Leo, the information about the Oasis lookout had already reached 100 great silver coins. As long as they gave specific information, they would be able to get money. Although there were some who tried to cheat their way through, most of them were mercenaries who wanted to take risks. They appeared in the desert like rats, bringing more than 10 days' worth of dry food and water. They foolishly wanted to cross the desert and head to the Oasis lookout. Everyone had a copy of the route map from the Dukedom of Leo, but less than 10% of them could make it to the Oasis lookout alive. The central posthouse didn't need captives. Rolf wasn't a kind person to begin with. Desert bandits. One could tell from their names that they wouldn't show the slightest bit of mercy. A large number of scattered mercenaries appeared here with the mentality of getting lucky and making a fortune. They were then discovered by the patrolling desert bandits and slaughtered in the desert with machetes and spears. Even if there were groups of 20 to 30 mercenaries that formed a small mercenary group and carriages that transported goods, they would still be caught by the desert bandits with their short pilum from afar. Then, they would gather more desert bandits and launch a surprise attack in the complex terrain of dune groups. They would easily take them away in one wave and slaughter them in the dune, turning them into miserable dried corpses in the desert or being eaten by the passing jackalen as food. As for those who were willing to surrender and be captured as captives, Rolf also had a troublesome idea to kill them all. It was very easy to cut a throat with a knife. The current Oasis lookout had already taken in over 1,000 captives. There was no shortage of slaves in the salt mine. After all, production was limited, and transporting supplies to these slaves was also a troublesome matter. After all, there were many people, and the supplies needed were also very large. Moreover, in the salt mine posthouse, they still needed to ensure the daily lives of the slaves. If 1,000 people caused a ruckus, it would not be a small deal. Entering the central posthouse, Rolf stood at the door and bowed respectfully. "Welcome, Lord Kant." Kant nodded and praised, "Well done." Looking at the tents not far away, many members and leaders of the trade caravan walked out and looked curiously at Kant and the others. The expressions of those who reacted quickly changed drastically, and they bowed respectfully on the spot. It was obvious that they had guessed the identity of the newcomers. The news that Kant had massacred those night attendants who had come to attack had long been spread back to the Dukedom of Leo. At the very least, the merchants who had arrived now did not dare to act rashly even if they had the support of the noble behind them. At the moment, Kant's still stronger. No one dared to offend him. Entering the hall of the posthouse, the mages heard of Kant's arrival and walked down to the second floor one after another. "How's the research going?" Kant still regarded these 18 mages highly. "It's going very smoothly." The mages did not let down their expectations and said with certainty, "The sun disk can be absorbed at any time, and the research on the 2 elemental bodies has also reached a certain conclusion. If we continue studying, we will definitely obtain useful results." "Very good." The corner of Kant's mouth curled up slightly. Turning his head to look out of the window, he said with a sigh, "But what we need to deal with now is still the undead." Chapter 336, Mistakes at the Central Posthouse. The undead are Kant's most immediate threat. At the very least, they had occupied the stone pass and displayed 10 royal knights, which was enough to intimidate the evil-minded noble. If they wanted to launch a threat of force, they had to at least get rid of these grand knights. Well, if a well-trained knight is the foundation and backbone of an army, then the Grand Knight, the world's high-end combat power, is the measure of the real combat power of this army benchmark. An army without an overseeing knight is nothing more than a garbage cannon fodder army made up of peasant and bandits. It has no effect on the real battlefield, only playing a small role in filling in the numbers, strengthening the momentum, and being the scapegoat in front. It was simply impossible to occupy them. Such troops would not even appear in real battles. As long as a noble had a bit of status, they would personally nurture knights and their attendant to form an elite squad. Peasant and armed militia would only be used in the barren northern county territory, the poorest stone pass. There was no such troop class in the other nobles' estate. At most, in order to ensure that certain areas, such as farms and villages, would not be attacked, the peasant soldiers would be armed to defend themselves against the enemy and delay the bandits' attack. When the knight troops led by the noble families arrived, they would be the real combat troops, such as lance soldiers, archers, and cavalry. The soldiers who wore double-layer iron scale armor, after years of training, were naturally at the level of a profession soldier. Even if there were no soldiers trained by the noble would also hire those mercenaries as followers. At the very least, the mercenaries would be able to do something with their money. It was better than these trash-like peasant soldiers, who would run away after 2 or 3 people died in a tragic battle. Before they were certain of Kant's true strength, no one would gather troops with great fanfare. Moreover, even the Grand Duke of Lyon, Cameron, who was still in his prime in the Lion Castle, had not made any statement on this matter. How could these nominal vassals make such an obvious decision? No matter how dirty the noble families were behind the scenes, they still had to at least have some face. For example, respect. Kant was of royal blood after all. He was the second son of Duke Cameron. Although they could send people to assassinate him in the dark, but it didn't mean that they could gather the troops in the territory on the surface and directly charge into the stone pass to launch an attack on the estate. Just as everyone was stalling or probing in the dark, Kant was undoubtedly given time to buffer. Of course, these noble families did not know about the strange movements in the depths of the Naran desert. They did not expect that Kant, who wished to die immediately, was now blocking the undead army for them and was trying his best to stop the spread of the curtain of death. This made Kant somewhat depressed. However, he wasn't really blocking it. Oasis Lookout was located on the route of the expansion of the curtain of death, and it happened to be blocking the way to the dukedom of Leo. In order to protect his own estate, Kant naturally had to fight back. He had to do everything in his power to block the mysterious and terrifying curtain of death in the depths of the Naran desert. Just like the current sun disk. They arrived at the second floor of the posthouse. In the room, the sun disk, which had already been enlarged, was wrapped in a linen cover. It was tightly covered to prevent it from being discovered by trade caravans or spies outside. This was a strange object, an artifact-like item. Kant naturally could not let outsiders know about. "My lord," the mages reported, "the sun disk can fuse with other strange objects of the same type at any time to strengthen itself." Kant nodded, "Very good." The mages continued to report, "According to our research, perhaps when a certain number of strange objects of the same type fuse together, it will produce a qualitative change, increasing new abilities and powers. Of course, this is impossible to predict. We can only let this sun disk fuse first so that we can continue our in-depth research. No matter what, it will be very good if we can solve the death curtain of the undead." Kant's expression was calm. This time, he brought back 7 sun disks. When they returned to the Oasis Lookout, there was still 1 sun disk waiting to be absorbed. A total of 10 strange objects of the same type fused together, and perhaps the qualitative change that the mages spoke of would appear. Even if the qualitative change was not possible, Kant could still afford to wait. At most, he could continue to search for this sun disk in the Naran Desert and the Sinway range. After all, he now understood that the Naran Desert was indeed buried with the remains of the ancient era of the gods. The secrets of the lost city were about to be unraveled by him. "Lord, are we going to fuse now?" the mages asked. Kant frowned slightly. No. He rejected this proposal. Coming to the window of the room, he could just see that not far away, there was a temporary camp made up of hundreds of tents set up by the trade caravan. Many people were looking over here, as if they were gathering intelligence. When they saw Kant looking at them, they all pulled their heads back like quails. "Humph!" Kant snorted, "There are too many people and too many eyes. Let's talk about it when we get back." "Yes." The mages nodded. When they went back, they naturally meant to return to the Oasis Lookout. That was their real home. The central posthouse that they were at now was just a posthouse. Even if there were many cavalry and trade caravans gathered, which was equivalent to a small village, in reality, it was just a temporary trade point because of the table salt trade. If there was no trade, the posthouse would return to its former tranquility. Right. Kant retracted his gaze and turned his head to ask, "Where are the two corpses?" The mages looked at each other, with some embarrassment. They said, "It's hard to believe. These two corpses are very compatible with the magic system of the Unfoth Empire, just like silver cups and malt liquor. When we were conducting magic experiments, we opened the portal from the Unfoth Empire and entered the Grand Magic Tower in the Empire's capital." Hey! Kant frowned slightly and asked in surprise, "The Grand Magic Tower of the Unfoth Empire?" "Yes, we overestimated our own magic level." The mages were even more embarrassed. "We wanted to summon them in reverse. We wanted to activate the remaining, almost pure elements in these two corpses, but we made some mistakes. We had no choice but to use the Void Gate to get the help of the Grand Mages in the Grand Magic Tower to summon them over to avoid losing them in the void." "I understand." Kant nodded. His face was calm, without the slightest hint of anger. "Please forgive us for our mistakes." The mages were even more embarrassed. This was not their first mistake. In fact, it was the 7 mages who had leveled up from the mage apprentices. The sandstorm caused by the Oasis lookout back then was one of the reasons for the current crisis. Or rather, it was the main reason. However, Kant still did not get angry. To be honest, he was already somewhat used to it. "Be careful next time." Looking at the embarrassed mages, Kant said calmly, "Then, what will happen to the two corpses that entered the Grand Magic Tower of the Unfoth Empire?" "I don't think it will cause too many changes." The mages quickly said, "It won't. It will be studied by our mentor, the existence of a great mage." "That's good." Kant nodded. A great mage was a troop class that was level up to level 3 after a mage leveled up. It was an extremely profound knowledge of magic. It was an existence that had reached the pinnacle of human magic power. It could be said to be a ferocious beast in human form. As long as they were given a certain amount of time to cast their spells, even a titan or a dragon would have to dodge. After all, they had studied magic for their entire lives and it was a war spell. Its lethality was extremely shocking. "Let's go." Kant did not waste any time. Looking at the slightly slanted sunlight outside the window, it was already afternoon. He instructed the mages, "Everyone, get on your horses and follow me." After a pause, he turned his head and instructed the Lion Knights guarding the door, "The 2 of you stay behind. When the camel caravan arrives, get those camels to transport this solar disk back." "Yes." The 2 Lion Knights at the door immediately responded. The sun disk, which had been transformed by the magic of the Unfoth Empire, was already very huge. Although it could levitate, it was actually very heavy. If they wanted to move, they would need 10 mages to cast spells to levitate, which was quite strenuous. If they used regular manpower, they would need to use warhorse or camels to drag it. With the force of levitation, it would be like pulling a maglev train, slowly heading towards the Oasis lookout. They were still very slow. Therefore, Kant did not intend to stay here and wait for the sun disk. "Lord Kant, there will be a camel caravan coming tonight." Rolf walked up at this time. After assigning the patrol task, he walked up to the second floor and happened to hear Kant's arrangement. He suggested, "Why don't we wait for the camel caravan to arrive at night, unload the table salt, and rest for the night? When we set off tomorrow at dawn, you can also rest." Kant thought for a while and nodded. "All right, that's it then. My lord, we'll communicate with our mentor through the Spirit Network and the Grand Mage Tower of the Unfoth Empire at night. If we discover any secrets, we'll report immediately." The mages also began to make up for their mistakes. Kant nodded. Since things had come to this was the only way. Towards these mages, he did not show much anger, nor did he have any intention of getting angry out of humiliation. Those were only 2 corpses. To him, their value was not even as much as that coffin made of gold. Even if he didn't research anything, it did not matter. Of course, it would be even better if he could research it. He still had a positive attitude towards great mages. Those old mages who had been immersed in magic for almost 70 to 80 years were definitely experienced. At the very least, they were much more reliable than apprentices and mages. They were also the backbone of the Unfoth Empire. In Kant's troop class, they could not even directly level up. They could only unlock it through the world of werewinds. At least even if the mages had enough experience points, they would not be able to level up. Perhaps it was because of the rules. However, Kant still had some expectations for the archmages. If these top-tier mages really entered his command system, then their power on the battlefield would really be like an infantry battalion adding a 155 howitzer-like heavy cannon. Chapter 337, Studying the System of Divine Spells. In the evening, the sun was setting in the west, about to fall below the horizon. The dim yellow sunlight filled the entire desert, as if the posthouse had been dyed with a layer of gold. With dazzling cast gold armor, nightfall was right around the corner. However, on the north side, between the dune communities, there was a long line passing through. It was an orderly line of 50 strong one-humped camels that were leisurely strolling over. Their wide hooves were able to fully step on the soft layer of sand. Their outstanding talent of being able to endure cold, heat, and trekking allowed these desert elves to shuttle between the sea of sand at a seemingly slow speed, like a light boat. Riding on it, the Swadian peasant was half sprawled and half asleep in boredom, just as leisurely. They were very comfortable. Along the way, apart from the harsh environment, the so-called suffering of trekking was not unbearable. The abundant food and supplies, as well as sufficient fresh water, allowed them to enjoy a wonderful time even when they had to set up camp. For the past 2 or 3 days, the traveling itself was like enjoying desert scenery. They had already learned how to take care of themselves in the desert from the Sarandian people. It was just like learning how to tame camels. Of course, their current comfort was also related to the 40 desert bandits beside them. They were carrying scimitars, short spears on their backs, and long spears. They were running back and forth on guard. Recently, in the desert, they would occasionally encounter escaping slaves who had nowhere else to go or trade caravans that claimed to be lost. However, these desert bandits were the ones who dealt with them. If they dared to resist, they would take their lives with their spears or scimitars. Their bodies would be casually thrown in the desert and turned into dried corpses under the sun, becoming a ready-made deterrence sign. Even if they didn't resist, the final result would depend on the mood of the desert bandits. If they were in a good mood, they would be taken back as slaves. If they were in a bad mood, there would be nothing to say. They would throw out sharp short javelins and kill them directly. The so-called runaway slaves and lost trade caravan were in fact spies of the dukedom of Leo. Rolf had long warned the passing caravans, as well as the desert bandits escorting the trade caravan, to be on high alert. And they had the understanding that even killing the innocent is better than letting anyone go. Kant silently approved of this. Because he would do it too. If he encountered any spies who attempted to infiltrate the Naran desert, he would definitely choose to kill them without leaving any loose ends. This was Kant's base, the headquarters, a place that absolutely could not be touched by outsiders. Even if they encountered a descendant of a bankrupt merchant like Borg back then, they would not be allowed to try their luck here in desperation. He couldn't set up too many spies. That would become conspicuous. At least for Kant. What did the decline of other people's families have to do with him? Kant only needed to take responsibility for himself. At night, Rolf especially held a grand banquet for Kant's arrival. He took out all kinds of food and cooked it as delicately as possible, so as to make this banquet even more perfect. Although there weren't any chefs trained by the Artisan Guild in Trondheim Castle or Arran City. But the commoners still knew how to fry and cook. Everything still tasted exceptionally delicious. Compared to the simple baked bread and dried meat, these fresh ingredients that were specially cooked were nice and juicy in the mouth. Coupled with the precious spices that were obtained through bribing by the merchants of the Dukedom of Leo, it was enough to support the level of luxury for this banquet. Of course, those merchants who had finished trading table salt outside had long been driven away. At present, only Kant's troops remained in the Naran desert. A large number of desert bandits spread out in groups of 2 or 3, whistling through the surrounding desert plains and dune. They rode their horses and patrolled, cautiously looking for any enemies that might be hidden. There were many times when spies hid in the desert at night to avoid patrols. However, the temperature in the Naran desert was several tens of degrees below zero at night. If they wanted to live, they had to build a bonfire the next day to be able to walk, which would expose their position. As long as the desert bandits searched carefully, even if they were in the dark behind the dune and used their leather jackets to hide the light, they would still be able to sense that something was wrong. If they rode their horses closer, they would be able to find the rats that were trying to deceive them. At that time, their companion would not be their achievements after the investigations. Instead, it would be their sharp scimitars and spears. In order to ensure that Kant, the Supreme Lord, could rest, even the Sarandian horsemen had moved out. Wearing Sarandian chain armor, a leather jacket, leather pants, and a leather cloak, a group of people walked in a formation among the dune. Any difficult or troublesome enemy would attract their attention and be dealt with even more exquisite combat techniques. Desert bandits were, after all, light cavalry and were not main forces. Once the matters get serious, they still had to look for the stronger Sarandian horsemen. As a few unlucky fellows were found, the Sarandian horsemen and the desert bandits did not hold back. They directly shed blood. Using the machete in their hands, they let the heads of these unlucky fellows leave their necks. The night was filled with a tragic color of blood. Kant slept extremely soundly. This was because the sun disk had already been activated, allowing the surrounding temperature to become suitable. The night passed without much incident. The morning arrived very quickly. Kant, who had already developed a good sleep schedule in the desert, also woke up with the appearance of the dawn. He simply tidied up his clothes, wiped his body, washed his hands and face, and meticulously applied a layer of sunscreen made from oil and spices before walking out of the room. Beside him was the room of the mages. It was a little noisy in the early morning. Kant pushed the door open and walked in, only to find that the 18 mages were still surrounding the floating sun disk. They were still arguing and explaining intensely, as if they had some differences on the next route. The situation was a little tense. Both sides were clearly divided into 2 groups, each with their own arguments. It was obvious that both sides had their own theories. Cough. Kant frowned slightly and coughed lightly to signal for him to come in. At the same time, looking at these mages, he could not help but ask, "What's going on? Why are you starting the discussion so early? Did you guys come up with something?" "My lord, good morning." Only then did the mages react and quickly bowed to greet him. Kant nodded. "It's like this, my lord." The captain of the mages shrugged slightly, his tone was also somewhat helpless. "Last night, the archmages of the Unfoth Empire sent news. They successfully analyzed the saintess who belonged to the sun god's descendant and found a special and pure energy in her body. It wasn't completely positive positive energy. That's right. It's a type of positive energy that belongs to category of positive energies, but has a higher level. It's extremely special." The surrounding mages nodded and agreed with the captain's point of view. This was also their conclusion. Kant frowned. "More colloquial. Although it's a little confusing, it's true. It's a higher level of positive energy." The mage captain pondered for a moment and answered in detail, "Just like the power of God." "The power of God?" Kant frowned even more. There were no gods in the world of werewinds. There were only higher-level creatures, such as angels, titans, dragons, and so on. For example, in Pandey's prophecy, in the world of light and darkness, although there was not much difference from the usual history, in fact, there were also gods. For example, the leader and the magic ring showed the world-destroying devil god as the final boss. Therefore, the mages in the world of Werewolf did not have a deep impression of gods. It was only after they came to this world and came into contact with the so-called power of the gods in this world that they had a rough idea of gods. However, when they studied the corpse of the saintess of the sun god's descendant, they found pure, high-level, and special positive energy from it. It made them even more confused. The captain of the mages said in a deep voice, "Where our conclusions differ is the definition of this positive energy. Is it a kind of positive energy or a completely transformed god power?" "Oh, that's it." Kant chuckled. "Yes." The mages nodded. Academic questions are always strict and rigorous. However, Kant, who had the experience of his previous life, waved his hand and said, "Why don't you treat this power as the positive energy used by the gods?" Kant paused slightly and said, "For example, the divine spell system that is different from the magic system." Divine spell system. The mages were shocked, but then their eyes widened. "That's right." Kant nodded. "In this world, there used to be gods in the ancient times, so there were traces left behind in the temples. Although in the age of chaos, the spells were not visible, but they were still beyond the imagination of ordinary people. For example, the spells of the mages and the divine spell of the priest were the extraordinary power of knights. Divine spell was a power that was passed down from one temple to another. It was similar to a normal spell. But it was completely different. Kant did not know much about it because in the human countries, knights, mages, and priests were almost equivalent to three fields. Although they were related, they were in fact completely different. Knights were the noble class, the cornerstone of a country. Mages were the scholars in the mage tower. Although they mastered spells, they rarely participated in politics and management. As for priests, they were the forces of the Pantheon temple. They accepted the worship of the country and provided faith to the commoners and the noble. Of course, most of them were for the commoners. It was still uncertain whether the so-called noble believed in God or not. This was the age of chaos after the fall of the gods. Without a real God, there would naturally be no real faith. The divine spell system proposed by Kant also came from this world. It might be useful. The mages nodded, their faces showing a hint of understanding. After discussing with each other, they said to Kant respectfully, "Lord Kant, if there's an opportunity, please find some information about divine spell for us. It might be useful for the many great mages of our Onfoth Empire." "Yes, it's very simple." Kant nodded. The Dukedom of Leo had the War Gods Temple, which was established as the national religion. As for the information about divine spell, there were even more in the Silver Platter Kingdom. It was said that in the local divine temple of light, it had formed the holy church with the king and the noble. It had completely dispersed the power of the mages and formed a country where the church and the state were united. There, they would have more information on divine spells. After settling this matter, Kant opened his mouth and instructed, "Pack up. We are ready to set off." Chapter 338, Spies encountered at night. With ample preparations, the group continued their journey. Behind them was a camel caravan consisting of 50 single-humped camels, carrying loads of goods on their backs. They were all merchants from the Dukedom of Leo who had come for the table salt trade. They had brought the goods along with their wagons. However, they were not good things either. They were just farm tools made from inferior iron and ordinary grain. There were some more valuable spices. As for iron products made of refined iron, including high-grade farm tools, were all unavailable. Not to mention those weapons and armors that could arm civilians and enhance the combat strength of soldiers. These things were definitely not seen in these merchants' wagons. It was completely a tacit agreement among the merchants to not trade with high-quality goods. And even if there were weapons, they were mostly warrior longsword made of ordinary iron ingots used by the guards. Even the armors they brought over were the lowest grade of leather armors. This was the result of the noble families of the Dukedom of Leo after a discussion. In their view, the Oasis lookout in the Naran desert had already been occupied by Kant. This baron, who should have been exiled to a remote desert to wait for his death, had regained the initiative with the help of some hidden forces. He had even discovered a salt mine that was of high value, which increased his wealth and force. The value of salt was extremely high. The noble families of the Dukedom of Leo and the Silver Platter Kingdom were willing to send out a large army to wage war. Even if it were by force, they would seize the salt mine that could produce high-grade table salt in their own hands. It was just that it was still too short a time, and everyone had yet to react. For the sake of conservatism, they were only taking precautions first. Or it could be called probing. Without absolute certainty, they would not act. Sealing off trade goods was one of the means. Banning the sale of weapons and armors, banning the sale of iron ingots, banning the sale of military supplies, the goal was to seal off the Oasis lookout, seal off the Naran desert, and let Kant fall into the plight of shortage of supplies. However, they did not know that Kant did not need their supplies. In fact, it was also true for the grain that was gradually decreasing in trading. The well-developed and self-recycling Trondheim Castle and Arran City were completely self-sufficient, and even the urgently needed supplies could be traded in Karadia or Pender. This world didn't have much of a need for Kant. Except for the Golden Eagle. That shiny, gold-forged, extremely valuable currency that could be exchanged for a dinar. The people of this world could not realize that these golden eagles that seemed precious but were not of much use were dinar that could be exchanged for everything to Kant. Just like now, every time Kant traded table salt, he would receive 200,000 plus dinars. He had long gotten rid of the period of poverty. He was on the way to prosperity. The army had begun to be trained on a large scale with the establishment of castles and cities. There would be more tragic battles in the following wars. Even if Kant had a higher level extraordinary troop class, they would still be nothing more than meat lumps with bones when facing the extremely large-scale battlefield that was like a meat grinder. The extraordinary troop class would also be injured and die. Even high-level creatures such as titans, angels, dragons, and so on would be the same. Kant still could not relax. Especially when he learned about the past glory of this world, he could not ignore the heritage that was still passed down. At least Kant had not really attacked the human countries yet. He still did not have a clear understanding of the true high-end forces of the human countries, such as the coalition forces formed by the Grand Knights, Mages, and Priests. The two sides only had a short contact. Kant had only revealed his strength appropriately. But in terms of the level of elite troops, Kant had the backing of countless riding worlds. He was definitely stronger than this world, including the Dukedom of Leo. The only thing Kant was afraid of now was the remnants from the era of the gods. For example, those demons. Those undead. And those gods who might still be alive. It was true that it was the end of the magic era, but since even demons, undead, and gods' descendants had appeared recently, was it possible that some gods were still alive until now? Perhaps the gods that the human countries worshipped originated from the remaining gods. Kant was cautious. This was also the reason why he did not directly launch a forceful attack and expose his strength first. Although defeating enemies was refreshing, there were more side effects. Slowly invading was the way of the king. Occupying step by step, spreading step by step, attacking step by step, forcing step by step. Finally, he obtained an absolute advantage. Whether it was the Stone Pass or the Resnistican River in the East County, Kant planned to slowly develop and infiltrate. Even if he had to spend 10 or 20 years, he would slowly infiltrate the Dukedom of Leo until he could swallow it whole. There would be no violent reaction from the enemies. This was the terror of encroachment. Although he could not swallow the entire dukedom in an instant and would need to use military means to forcefully unify the dukedom, dealing with the problem of bloating his stomach afterwards was also painful. If he was careless and was instead picked by other forces, then he would regret it in the beginning. The Mantis stalks the Cicada, the Oriole is behind the Mantis. Although Kant was the Oriole at the moment, but who knew if the ancient forces were hidden behind Kant, like a giant eagle ready to hunt the Oriole? Kant did not believe that all the gods were dead. Perhaps there were some of them still alive. It was late in night. The group of people continued to return with the caravan. The temperature in the Naran desert was very low at night, but they were all covered by leather jackets and pants. They could barely keep warm and not fall into a desperate situation because of the -30 degrees temperature. The temperature between the day and night was very extreme. And because there were no snowflakes, it was a temperature that could freeze people to death. The name of the desert of civilization, the forbidden area of races, was not a joke. Even those low-level jack-allans who had the innate ability to endure and had fur like animals had to build a bonfire at night in the Naran desert. If there was no bonfire, then they would dig through the layers of sand and squeeze into each other to keep warm. Kant and the others were able to barely move forward thanks to the help of the system power in their bodies. If it were a normal human or warhorse or camel, they would probably freeze to death. Clop, clop, clop. The hooves of the horses broke through the sand, making a special sound. Kant turned his head to look. A desert bandit who should have spread out to scout the path were quickly approaching on their horses. "My lord, at the dune in front, we found an unfamiliar group of 10 people. They are now under our control and are not pose any danger for the time being," the desert bandit reported. "Should we get rid of them?" As he said that, he raised his hand into a palm and blurred it at his neck. "We can get rid of them very quickly. They are all damn spies, a bunch of trash like rats." "Well, that's it." Kant waved his hand casually. Indeed, he did not care. Just like the desert bandit said, these spies were just a bunch of trash like rats. A group of spies who wanted to investigate Kant's background. There were no so-called human rights for them. Of course, there was no so-called humanitarian aid or merciful forgiveness. "Understood," the desert bandit nodded with a sinister smile. Turning his horse around, he quickly left to pass on the order. There are more and more spies." Kant couldn't help but shake his head. He frowned slightly and said to Bunduk behind him, "I didn't expect that we would be able to discover these spies even though we are almost at the Oasis lookout area. I really didn't expect that either." Bunduk nodded. He had lived in the Oasis lookout before, so he naturally understood the importance of the Oasis lookout. Especially Rolf, who had been frantically searching for spies at the central posthouse. He had killed nearly 300 rats recently, and even such a terrifying method had not stopped the spies from coming. Only an even more brutal massacre could deter those greedy guys. Kant and Rolf actually had the same idea. This was also the reason why he tacitly allowed Rolf to start a massacre at the central posthouse. But very soon, the desert bandit returned on horseback. Kant couldn't help but frown and ask, "What happened?" "There's a situation." The desert bandit didn't panic. It seemed that there wasn't a crisis that couldn't be dealt with. Instead, he calmed his mind and quickly reported to Kant clearly, "The spies claimed themselves as the forces left behind in the dukedom of Leo by your biological mother, Princess Sophia. They said they were here to contact you." He said in a serious tone, "My lord, we are unable to determine whether this is true or false." "Yes." Kant's expression was calm. "I understand. You can go down. Keep an eye on them." Bunduk waved his hand, indicating for the desert bandits to leave. This kind of matter indeed needed to be reported. Matters related to the Lord's family were no longer something that soldiers like them could handle. Even Bunduk was a little troublesome. Looking at his Supreme Lord beside him, who was slightly silent, he could not help but ask, "Lord Kant, do you want to personally meet these spies?" Ha, interesting. Kant snorted coldly, the corners of his mouth curling up into an inexplicable smile. His eyes were cold. He turned to the Lion Knight beside him and ordered, "Bring those 10 spies over. I want to see what the forces left behind by my mother are." "Yes." One of the Lion Knights nodded and immediately spurred his horse forward, rushing towards the dune. "Let's set up camp here." Kant continued to instruct, "The night is very dark, and the temperature is getting colder." He paused, took a deep breath of the cold air, and said lightly, "I'm also a little tired." "Understood," the surrounding soldiers nodded. Soon, the camp and the bonfire rose together. In the dune far away, 20 desert bandits were carrying spears and scimitars. They were walking around 10 guys in hoods and cloaks. The Lion Knight was the first to report, "Lord, they're here." "Got it." Kant nodded. The 10 guys in black linen hood also came in front of him. They looked at the Lion Knights and the mages in leather coats who were still holding their staffs. Their eyes were filled with shock, but they bowed respectfully, "Greetings, Prince Kant." "Prince?" Kant smiled lightly. Looking at these people who had taken off their hood, who were obviously middle-aged men, he said calmly, "You seem to have called me by the wrong title. In the dukedom of Leo, I'm just a baron." Chapter 339, The Princess Old Subordinates. The 10 spies in front of them were terrified and respectful towards Kant. They did not dare to show their so-called rebelliousness in front of this young man who was now known for his cruel methods. Therefore, they all knelt in front of Kant. The leader even put his right hand on his chest. He lowered his head and said respectfully, "That's right. Our title comes from the princess we are loyal to, which is the respected Princess Sophia of the Silver Platter Kingdom, your biological mother, Prince Kant." "My mother, Princess Sophia." Kant's voice was calm. Looking at the 10 respectful fellows in front of him, he said calmly, "But even so, I am still a baron, even if my mother is indeed a princess. She was a princess belonging to the Silver Platter Kingdom." The leader quickly explained, "But you have the right to inherit the Silver Platter Kingdom, Prince Kant." There was a slight silence. The surrounding Sarlian Lion Knights and the mages of the Unfoth Empire all turned their heads to look at this guy. Even Kant narrowed his eyes and slowly said, "Speak clearly. Such words must not be taken as a joke. If I know that you are deceiving, then you will be executed." "Definitely not a joke." That guy quickly explained, "His Majesty King Ulysses of the Silver Platter Kingdom only has one son left, but that prince has always been in poor health. According to the news from the palace, this prince, who is older than you but abnormally weak, will definitely not live past next year." "Ha, interesting. This news is very interesting." Kant narrowed his eyes, which were full of threatening aura. So the leader mustered up his courage and said, "We are here to look for you." The other spies also looked at Kant with eager eyes. The surrounding desert bandits and lion knights had already unsheathed their scimitars and longsword. Their cruel eyes made these pitiful worms that had entered the Naran desert have no intention of resisting at all. They were all smart people. They understood what the current situation was like. If they dared to resist, they would probably be beheaded. After all, Kant, this young lord, had a reputation of being bloodthirsty and decisive in killing. He had completely lost his previously benevolent and cowardly appearance. Perhaps there was an inside story, but everyone knew that if they dared to resist, they would have no choice but to die. It would be better to explain why they came. Therefore, the leader gulped and looked at Kant, who seemed to be deep in thought. He said urgently, "Prince Kant, you are the only son of Princess Sophia, and the only grandson of King Ulysses of the Silver Platter Kingdom. If your sick prince uncle dies, you will be the only heir of the Silver Platter Kingdom, and the only descendant of the old king. Therefore, we have experienced countless hardships and came to seek refuge with you to help you obtain the throne that belongs to you." The scene remained silent, because Kant did not reply. The surrounding knights and mages had unfriendly expressions. They had come from a chaotic and dangerous world. They had their own views on the fight for the throne and the right to inherit. Of course, they also understood the dangers involved. The throne that represented power, even though it seemed like Kant could reach out and touch it, but the dangers hidden in the shadows. The dangers that were enough to kill him. Kant's silence was also because of this matter. Fighting for the throne was not something that he could do with just the death of a prince. After all, the noble families of the Silver Platter Kingdom also represented traditional forces. Only the royal bloodline that the noble families chose or compromised in support of could take that throne. And Kant, the second son of the Grand Duke of Leo Cameron, the little baron who had been exiled in the Naran Desert and was separated from the entire dukedom of Leo, could not extend his hand that long. Moreover, how could Kant know that these guys were not liars? Were they here to deceive him, to beg for his life, or to use this matter as an excuse to secretly investigate the Oasis lookout? "You're lying." Bunduk and Kant could be said to have a tacit understanding. Especially after being advanced by the power of the underworld, Bunduk's senses became stauncher. When they saw Kant's silent look, he immediately took half a step forward and pulled out half of the night sword at his waist. With an indifferent expression, he berated, "You are from the Silver Platter Kingdom. ***, how dare you lie to Baron Kant? What are you? A bunch of lowly commoners, how can you casually talk about the inheritance of the royal family?" Clang, 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 clang. The clanging sound of metal suddenly appeared in the surroundings. It was the weapons that the Sarlian Lion Knights and the Desert Bandits had already unsheathed. Under the moonlight, they shone with a miserable cold light. In contrast, the 10 fellows were also scared to death. If Kant gave the order, these knights and the Desert Bandits did not mind slicing them to death. "No, Lord Kant, please listen to our explanation. We absolutely have no intention of deceiving you. After all, we were once loyal to Princess Sophia." The leader's face was filled with fear. He knelt on the ground and his entire body was trembling, especially when he thought of Kant's infamous name. He quickly said, "We were once knights brought by Princess Sophia to the dukedom of Leo. However, due to the princess' death, we were implicated and could only conceal our identities. We hid in the Resnistican River in between the dukedom of Leo and the Silver Platter Kingdom. We are struggled to survive. Now, we have become pirates. We have no intention of deceiving you. We only hope that you can become the king and restore our reputation." Ha! Kant showed slight contempt and disdain for their so-called loyalty to his mother. Loyalty seemed official, but it was still fragile. Baron Dillon at the Stone Pass had once been loyal to his Princess Sophia, but he still ignored Kant. After learning about the salt mine, he even wanted to secretly control Kant as a puppet. Therefore, this so-called loyalty was especially laughable to Kant. Their loyalty could not be compared to the people from the world Mount and Blade. However, Kant did not reveal too much. He indifferently glanced at the 10 terrified fellows. He said, "I have an impression of the pirates of the Resnistican River. You are indeed very famous." He paused for a moment. "But why did you choose to become pirates instead of living in the dukedom of Leo or returning to the Silver Platter Kingdom? This is a little strange." His voice was solemn. When the surrounding knights heard Kant's serious question, they all glared at these guys. The weapons in their hands were already tightly gripped. It seemed that if one of them was lying, they would be able to directly strike them. We can't go back." The leader had a sorrowful expression on his face. "When Princess Sophia marries Grand Duke Cameron, we followed Princess and became the Royal Knights, the Knights of the Dukedom of Leo." The others also said sorrowfully, "There is definitely something fishy about Princess Sophia's death. Lord Kant, I think you also know that if we do not hide ourselves, we will definitely be strangled by the noble families of the Dukedom of Leo. Even if we return to the Silver Platter Kingdom, King Ulysses will not let us off." "So, you hid in the Resnistican River?" Kant asked. "Yes, we had no choice." These people looked ashamed. If we want to live, we can only give up our former honor. If we don't choose to become pirates, we will be like the knights who chose to stay in the dukedom of Leo or return to the Silver Platter Kingdom. We will be forced by the noble families of those two countries to fight on the front lines to prove our loyalty. We will be consumed on the battlefield. Even if we survive, we will be pushed aside and never step into the circle of the mainstream noble families. Kant narrowed his eyes. They were right. For example, Baron Dillon. Kant understood this very well. After his mother, Princess Sophia, died of illness, the Silver Platter Kingdom had always taken the opportunity to look for trouble. In the end, the two sides continued to have bad blood. They even directly sent troops to invade the dukedom of Leo. Because of this, both sides started a war. In the end, even the old king of the Silver Platter Kingdom, Kant's grandfather, died on the battlefield. The Grand Duke of Leo, Cameron, succeeded the throne on the battlefield. After the two sides went through a bitter battle, the dukedom of Leo was left in a miserable state. Only then did the two sides start a peace negotiation. The result of the peace negotiation was that a piece of land south of the East County, which was also the south bank of the Resnistican River, along with a castle, Nazir Castle, became the territory of the Silver Platter Kingdom. This was also one of the main reasons why Countess Agatha and Grand Duke Cameron fell out. Nazir Castle was once the castle and land of the East County. But there was no other way. The dukedom of Leo could not compare to the strength of Silver Platter Kingdom. Moreover, the battle situation was still a Pyrrhic victory. After settling these matters and signing a contract with the Silver Platter Kingdom, Grand Duke Cameron led his troops back. At the same time, in order to resolve the dissatisfaction of the many noble families towards the peace talks, he chose to head directly to the Scenway arranged to deal with the invading low-level Jack Allens. After invading the Naran Desert and temporarily seizing the Oasis lookout, he used the new war to resolve the conflict. All of this had happened only 10 years ago. Although Kant was still studying in the academy, he actually understood quite a bit of the inside story. This has nothing to do with me. Kant looked calm and shook his head. The so-called throne of the Silver Platter Kingdom was a sweet poison to him. If he really wanted to inherit the throne, then he would have to first give up the forces in the Naran Desert, because there was a dukedom of Leo in between the Naran Desert and Silver Platter Kingdom. Although Kant could still command his forces remotely, he was unfamiliar with the Silver Platter Kingdom, so who could he rely on? It was equivalent to putting all his life in the hands of the people of the Silver Platter Kingdom, and he was not as free as he was now. And in terms of development potential, Kant thought that with the world of Mount and Blade as his backing, he would definitely be able to develop in the future without help. In the future, his forces would not be as powerful as a dukedom or a kingdom of the same status. Kant was very confident in himself. But looking at these 10 people who were terrified and sorrowful, he realized that he might be able to recruit some spies. Resnistican River, it happened to be at the place where Kant was about to plan. "Come in the tent, I have something to tell you." Kant turned around and walked into the tent that had already been set up, with the Lion Knights beside him as guards. The 10 guys looked at each other and lowered their heads to enter the tent. Although they didn't have much ability, they were a group of pirates from the Resnistican River after all. With the help of the forces that they had been brewing for more than 10 years, Kant's forces could reach to the most prosperous river in the shortest time possible. Perhaps he could set up another group of spies besides Borg. Chapter 340, Subdued the Water Bandits easily. In the tent, Kant officially issued new orders to these 10 old subordinates who had come to seek refuge. Or rather, Kant chose to accept them. He even gave 1,000 great silver coins to these guys. He asked them to use them as the funds for the activities in the Resnistican River to help Kant infiltrate. Of course, Kant did not tell them about Borg. One must be wary of others. He did not know if this group of people who had fallen as water bandits could still choose to be loyal, or they were the double agents, whether their intention for coming here was to investigate the Oasis lookout. But Kant did not care. 1,000 great silver coins collided with a crisp sound in the bag. Although this amount of money was nothing to Kant, who controlled the salt mines, but to the 10 people who had now fallen as water bandits, their eyes were blank. No matter what thoughts they had in their hearts, they were immediately washed away by this huge amount of money. Their hearts were beating extremely fast, filled with the desire and greed for wealth. Kant's lips curled up slightly as he looked at the 10 of them who could no longer control themselves. He said faintly, "I don't care what method you use, just develop yourself in the Resnistican River. Every half a year, come to the Oasis lookout and I will give you 1,000 great silver coins as the campaign funds." "Yes, yes. Lord Kant," the 10 guys immediately reacted. Without any hesitation, they immediately knelt on the ground and humbly bowed to Kant. This was the most respectful etiquette in the world, a form of respect that was expressed by humiliating themselves. At the same time, it represented an incomparable submission. Yes. Kant sat in his seat calmly and accepted their submission. Beside him were the Lion Knights and Mages. They watched everything calmly. However, they were not ashamed of giving up their loyalty so easily to these 10 guys. "Get up!" Kant did not care. He stretched out his hand and looked at the 10 guys. "Oasis lookout is my estate. You do not have the right to enter yet. If you develop well in the Resnistican River, I will give you a sum of money." He paused, his voice was low, "If I sit on any throne, you will become my close noble. We will do our best to die for you." The 10 of them immediately kowtowed. They understood what Kant meant. That was correct. They became water bandits in Resnistican River without any honor left. Their former noble status was more like a thorn in their chest. They suffered day and night, unable to forget their former honor. To be able to become a noble, who would be willing to become a water bandit, surrounded by bandits, scumbags, and low-class people? Not to mention having money. A total of 1,000 shiny great silver coins. This was a huge sum of money that they might not have earned for 10 years when they were water bandits. If they encountered a patrol team or something unexpected happened, they would run out of money and live a difficult life, and they wouldn't even be able to afford black bread. Water bandits were not a good profession. Even if they had the power of the Silver Platter Kingdom behind them, they were still low-class people. They could not even compare to the status of mercenaries. Looking at their shocked expressions, Kant's smile carried a hint of mockery. He did not care what the purpose of this group of people was, but since they came here and took his great silver coins, it would be the same as saying that he had successfully set up a group of new spies in the Resnistican River. No one could give these water bandits 1,000 great silver coins directly, but Kant could. He did not have any feelings for these silver coins. If it was a golden eagle, he would definitely not give it out. As the silver coins that could not be exchanged for dinar, Kant really didn't mind at all. If he gave it to these guys, he would let them know how much benefits they would get if they followed him. That would be a safe way to bind a contract with them. In front of the shiny white silver coins, these group of people wouldn't resist the temptation of great benefits, they would give up their pride and followed Kant's order. Since they had already taken Kant's money, it did not matter even if there was still a force behind them. Kant would not care because the key point was that no one else could directly give them 1,000 great silver coins as funds. Kant would still give it to them once every 6 months. One had to know. Even the most prosperous Lionheart city in the Dukedom of Leo would only earn over 20,000 great silver coins a year in tax revenue. As for the merchants on the Resnistican River, they probably only earned 1,000 great silver coins despite they traded throughout the year. And this was after all the hard work, plus all kinds of gross profits. Great silver coins were really very valuable. Kant didn't talk much with these guys. What he needed was a verbal agreement to let these 10 former subordinates of his mother, as well as the forces behind them, return to his control and hide in the Resnistican River. The river passage of the ancient passage will be used in the future. Kant thought for a while. He quickly thought about it and had a little plan for the arrangements in the East County. Since I have the water bandits now, it will be more convenient. Kant would occupy the river mouth passage of Resnistikan River first, and he would build the village as well. He would also establish the lair of the water bandits. Before they were able to effectively control the area, these local water bandits in the Resnistikan River would be useful. At least they wouldn't harass them. Even if there were other water bandits coming to harass them, they would have someone to inform Kant beforehand. When dealing with the problem of the opposing water bandits, they would be able to handle it better. As for what would happen to the water bandits who were once part of Princess Sophia's old troop, that had nothing to do with Kant. In fact, these people were just mercenaries who were working for him with his great silver coins. Perhaps in the future, he would need fame and would not mind giving away some unimportant land so that they could continue to be a small noble. An emperor used thousands of gold to buy horse bones, then his subordinates would offer the real horses. As long as these natives were hired, more natives would be served under Kant. Of course, the true upper echelons would always be those who came from the world of Mount and Blade mods. Just like a colony, layer by layer, the top and important management would always be from the same side, while those unimportant positions or the middle and lower management would be given to those natives who were loyal to them. There was no need to subdivide this. Even in the continent of Cicada, they had already made good use of this matter. The kingdom of Nords, which was good at land warfare and trade, did things in this way. After all, they could be considered as intruders, outsiders from the continent of Cicada. Their true homeland was still in the continent of Nords in the north. That was their homeland. The continent of Cicada could indeed be considered as a colony occupied by the Nords. These was not what Kant concerned about at the moment. Let's stop here. Coming back to his senses, Kant waved his hand and said, Bunduk, you can settle the details with them. Understood. Bunduk nodded. As one of the few generals in Kant, there was no need to doubt Bunduk's ability. After listening for a period of time, he could understand how the follow-up arrangements would be carried out. In fact, there weren't too many complicated arrangements at the moment. They just needed to lie low and develop a network for Kant that was different from Borg's. They needed to do another infiltration line. We will do our best to solve any problems for you. At the same time, the 10 people in front of them who were kneeling on the ground and looking at Kant with eager eyes also reacted and quickly kowtowed again. They thanked him excitedly. The glory of Princess Sophia is blossoming on you, Lord Kant. Your kindness and talent have won us over. Bunduk's eyes flashed red as he looked at the 10 guys. He stood up calmly and said to them, Come with me. Lord Kant needs to rest. Yes, yes, the 10 of them bowed and left the tent with Bunduk. The tent fell silent. Kant sat on his seat and rubbed his temples. How interesting. A bunch of little rats with ulterior motives. The mage beside him said, They are lucky that we let them go just like that. He paused and looked at Kant. He said seriously, My lord, when you were communicating with them, these guys were terrified. Obviously, they lied about something. We can sense it. I know. Kant nodded calmly and snorted. It's okay. He did not rely on these guys to do anything important for him. Although he gave them 1,000 great silver coins directly, it was simply to buy their loyalty. He wanted to let these guys know that the benefits of following him would not be small. He wanted to use the great silver coins to exchange for their ability and loyalty. If he wanted outsiders to be completely loyal to him, he would have to take out even more great silver coins. Kant did not believe that no one else would give even more great silver coins onto this group of low-level water bandits. The gains did not make up for the losses. Only a lord who controlled salt mines and did not have much need for great silver coins could casually throw out 1,000 great silver coins like this with the entire world of Mount and Blade as his backing. If the nobles of the Dukedom of Leo or the Silver Platter Kingdom wanted to spend more money to bribe these water bandits, that would be a joke. These coins were enough to arm a well-equipped and well-trained 50-man infantry squad. Very soon, Bunduk returned. He entered the tent and reported to Kant, Lord, we had reached an agreement. Kant gestured for him to continue. They'll hide for the time being and use the funds to develop our forces. After we enter Resnistikan River, we'll take over everything. Bunduk reported, of course, I promised them that in the future, they would personally lead this force and receive the recognition they deserve, such as restoring their knighthood or even obtaining a higher rank. They believed it. Kant's lips curled up slightly. They had no choice but to believe it. Bunduk shrugged. I also told them to pay attention to the Silver Platter Kingdom. After all, that old king is about to pass away. As a member of the royal family, you, Lord Kant, do indeed have the right to inherit the throne. Bunduk paused for a moment and suggested, Lord Kant, perhaps you really should try and fight for it. We'll discuss it again. Kant shook his head. His expression was calm, without the slightest ripple. Right now, we have to deal with the undead in the depths of the Naran Desert first. After we finish dealing with those evil races, then we can talk. Yes. Bunduk nodded. That's it. Kant waved his hand and said, let them leave at dawn. At the same time, write a note to them. In the future, we can directly contact Firentis at the Stone Pass. The Stone Pass was already his territory. With Firentis personally overseeing it, he could solve these small problems.